They built the largest civilization of the ancient world. Cities laid out on a grid, drains beneath the streets, public baths anyone could use, trade routes that reached all the way to Mesopotamia. And we cannot read a single word they wrote. We cannot name one of their kings. We cannot even say for certain who they were. That is the problem at the center of this story. A civilization this advanced should have left a clear trail behind it. It left almost none. I went looking for why the Indus people collapsed, and I found a stranger question waiting underneath it. Where did they come from, and why did they vanish? The answer was never written on their seals or carved into their cities. It was buried in their bones. And recent ancient DNA work has finally pulled a signal out of them. What it revealed was not what anyone expected. To understand what was lost, you have to understand the scale of it, because the scale is almost difficult to believe. The Indus Valley Civilization sprawled across the northwest of South Asia, covering more than 1 million square kilometers. That is larger than its famous contemporaries in Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. And it was not a narrow strip of riverbank either. It stretched across forests and deserts and grazing land, from the highlands down to the sea, a single cultural world spanning every kind of landscape the region had to offer. Inside that vast territory stood the cities: Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Rakhigarhi, Dholavira, Ganeriwala. Some of them sat hundreds of kilometers apart, separated by terrain that should have made them strangers to one another. And yet they were built to the same plan, decorated in the same style, supplied through the same networks, as though a single mind had designed them all and then scattered them across a subcontinent. The engineering is where it stops feeling ancient at all. They built their cities on a grid, with streets laid out in straight lines and right angles. They fired their bricks to a standard size, the same proportions used in city after city, hundreds of kilometers apart. They ran covered drains beneath the streets and channeled wastewater out of their homes at a time when most of the world had never imagined such a thing. They raised great citadels and broad public buildings, and at Mohenjo-Daro, they built the structure we now call the Great Bath, a watertight pool fed and drained by its own plumbing. And here is the detail that should stop you. In Egypt and in Mesopotamia, the great monuments belonged to the few. The temples and the palaces were the property of priests and kings, raised by the elite and reserved for the elite. The Indus did something else entirely. Their grandest public buildings appear to have been open to ordinary people. The Great Bath was once assumed to be a sacred space for rulers and priests. It was later found to have served the wider population of the city. The monuments here were not built to tower over the people. They were built to be used by them. So picture it whole. A territory larger than two of the ancient world's greatest civilizations put together. Cities scattered across deserts and floodplains, yet identical in design. Standardized bricks, planned streets, indoor drainage, public works open to all. An entire civilization that ran with the precision of a machine and the openness of a community. A people who built all of this should be the easiest civilization in history to know. They left us their cities, their tools, their seals, their bones. They left writing on nearly everything they made, and they are the hardest civilization in the ancient world to understand. We can walk their streets and stand in their bathhouses and hold the seals they pressed by hand. We still cannot tell you who they were, so where did they come from? Begin where the evidence begins, which is in the ground, long before the cities existed. The trail runs back to a place called Mehrgarh, on the edge of the Baluchistan highlands in what is now Pakistan. Around 7,000 years before the Common Era, people settled there and stayed. They built houses of mud brick. They farmed wheat and barley. They herded cattle and goats. They buried their dead with care. This was not a camp or a passing stop. It was one of the earliest farming villages anywhere in South Asia, and it did not vanish. It grew. From Mehergarh and other early centers like Kot-Diji, the story moves forward slowly across thousands of years, with no single dramatic turn. Villages traded with villages, irrigation spread, towns swelled out of settlements, and as they grew, something began to organize itself. Distinct styles of pottery emerged across different regions, each with its own character, the early signatures of a shared world taking shape. Archaeologists call this the period of regionalization, and inside it, you can watch a civilization assembling itself piece by piece. As the larger settlements grew, the work inside them began to divide. People stopped doing a little of everything and started doing one thing well. Some made pottery, some made beads, some worked shell into bangles. This is what scholars call craft specialization, and it is the quiet engine of complexity. When people specialize, they must trade. When they trade, they must organize. And out of that organizing, a more intricate society is born. Then, around 3,300 years before the Common Era, the larger settlements crossed a threshold and became true cities. This is the moment the Indus Valley Civilization takes on the form we recognize, and here is the part that matters most. There was no invasion that brought it. No conquering people swept in from beyond the mountains to plant a civilization in foreign soil. As far as the archaeology can show, the Indus grew out of the ground beneath it. The cities are the descendants of the villages. The civilization is the descendant of Mehergarh. It rose, in place, over 5,000 years of patient continuity, and that should settle it. A civilization that grew slowly out of its own deep roots ought to have a simple answer to the question of where its people came from. They came from here. They were always here. But the soil can only tell you so much. Deep roots explain the cities. They explain the pottery and the bricks and the long, unbroken thread of settlement. They do not explain the people. They cannot tell you whose blood was in the villages of Mehergarh, or what streams of ancestry met and mingled before the first wall was ever raised. You cannot dig in the dirt any longer. You have to read the genome. Reading the genome of the Indus people is harder than it sounds, and for a long time, it was simply impossible. Ancient DNA is fragile, and the climate of Northwest South Asia is close to the worst environment on Earth for preserving it. Heat breaks the molecule down until nothing usable is left. So for decades, there was a strange silence at the center of the field. The seals and the bricks and the bones piled up in their thousands. The DNA. Inside those bones said nothing at all. Then the silence broke. Researchers recovered a genome from a woman buried at Rakhigarhi, one of the largest Indus cities, supported by related individuals connected to the Indus world. It was a thin thread of evidence pulled out of a near-hopeless climate. And what it showed quietly rearranged the whole story. The expectation, built up over a century of theorizing, was that the Indus people would turn out to be arrivals. A wave of farmers who came east from the Fertile Crescent, carrying agriculture into South Asia and replacing whoever had been there before. That was the assumption. Farming spread, and the farmers spread with it. The genome tells a different story. What it reveals is a fusion. The ancestry combines people who had lived in South Asia for tens of thousands of years, deep local hunter-gatherer lineages, blended with a strand of Iranian-related ancestry. And here is the detail that changes everything. That Iranian-related strand branched off very early, before farming was ever invented. These were not Fertile Crescent farmers bringing their crops with them. The Indus appear to have taken up agriculture largely on their own, an independent invention rather than an imported one. So the question we had been asking all along, where did the Indus people come from, was the wrong question. The answer was never a single homeland and never a single migrating tribe. It was a blend, formed in place, out of streams of ancestry that met in the same river valleys long before the first city rose. That is exactly why the origin never had a clean answer. There was no clean origin to find. And then there is what the DNA did not find, which may matter most of all. There was no significant trace of steppe ancestry in the mature Indus population. None of the genetic signature later associated with Indo-European speakers moving down from the grasslands of Central Asia. Hold on to that absence. It is the loaded fact that will explain how this civilization disappeared. It is worth being honest about the limits here. This is one strong genome and a handful of related samples, not 1,000. The bones are scarce, the conclusions still provisional, and a single skeleton cannot speak for 1 million square kilometers. But the shape of the answer has changed. The Indus were not strangers who landed on an empty shore. They were what happened when several peoples met and merged into something new. Look at what that fusion built when it reached its height. We call it the mature Harappan period, running roughly from 2,600 to 1,900 years before the Common Era, and it was the apex of everything the Indus would become. This was a Bronze Age industrial heartland. Thousands of craftspeople worked in the cities, turning raw material into treasure on a scale the ancient world had rarely seen. They made beads by the countless thousand. They worked terracotta into figures and vessels, and above all, they worked lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone prized across the entire ancient world, cut and carried out of the Indus and into the markets of distant kingdoms. So much wealth flowed out of this land that it left a mark in the records of other peoples. Far away in Mesopotamia, the scribes wrote of a rich kingdom to the east, a place of luxury and abundance they called Meluha. Many scholars believe Meluha was the Indus, glimpsed from the far side of the ancient world through the goods that came west. And the goods did come west. Picture a single trader loading his ship. Shell bangles from one city, beads from another, lapis from a third. He waits for the monsoon winds to blow in his favor, then sails from the coast of the Indus toward the Persian Gulf, stopping at small towns along the way. He winters in a foreign port among his own countrymen, in a quarter of the city where Indus traders gather, and when the winds turn, he sails home again, his hold full of goods from the west. That trade left fingerprints everywhere it touched. In Bahrain, the small state of Dilmun developed seals that blended the square Indus style with the cylinder seals of Mesopotamia. In Oman and in the lands of the Emirates, archaeologists have found Indus pottery, Indus goods, and in at least one place, Indus burial customs, as though a piece of the civilization had settled there and stayed. Now here's the part that should make your head turn. This is the best documented silence in the ancient world. The Indus left seals by the thousand, and nearly every one of them carries writing, short rows of symbols pressed and carved with care. We have the script. We have it in our hands, in vast quantity, all across their world. And we cannot read a word of it. Not one. No scholar has cracked it. We do not have the name of a single Indus king. We do not have the name of a god we can confirm. We have no law code, no chronicle, no treaty, no prayer we can understand. We can hold the seal a merchant once owned, and we cannot read what it says about him. There are only two witnesses left who might tell us who these people really were: the script and the bones, and only one of them has started talking. Here is one of the strangest things about the Indus, and the bones have quietly begun to explain it. We have found no kings. That sounds like a small thing. It is not. Every great civilization of the ancient world announces its rulers. Egypt has its pharaohs in their tombs of gold. Mesopotamia has its god-kings carved in stone, towering over rows of conquered enemies. The Indus, across more than 1 million square kilometers and 1,000 years of grandeur, has left us almost nothing of the kind. The debate began with the first excavators, and it has never fully ended. One of them, Sir John Marshall, looked at the city of Harappa and saw something remarkable. The houses were of similar size. There were no vast palaces lording over humble huts. He concluded the Indus were an equalitarian people, a society without kings. Another, Sir Mortimer Wheeler, looked at the same ruins and saw the opposite. Great buildings he believed were restricted to a ruling elite, the seats of priest-kings commanding a centralized state. Scholars have taken both sides ever since, but the ground keeps tilting toward Marshall. Look at the burials, and the silence is deafening. Across the Indus world, the graves are strikingly plain. Very few contain the rich grave goods, the gold and the treasure that mark out a ruling class in every other ancient society. People were buried much alike, and the grand buildings, the ones Wheeler imagined as palaces, keep turning out to be public. The great bath was open to the city, not sealed away for the few. Then remember where most of these people actually lived, not in the famous cities at all. The overwhelming majority of the Indus population lived in small rural villages, self-sufficient communities working the land. And they worked it with real intelligence, practicing intercropping, growing different plants in turn, and letting the soil rest and recover, a sustainable method South Asian farmers still use today. The villages were the true foundation. The cities sat on top of them. Even the question of war points the same way. Archaeologists have found tools that could have served as weapons, so the Indus were not perfect pacifists. But these objects are few, and they appear mostly in the cities. There is no sign of a society organized around conquest, no monuments to slaughter, no evidence of armies on the march. The picture is of a people who managed their vast world in relative peace. And now the genome speaks to all of it. A people formed by fusion rather than conquest. A people spread thin across an enormous land with no genetic sign of a foreign elite imposed from outside. The graves say no kings. The DNA says no conquerors. They agree. This was a decentralized, broadly equal, remarkably peaceful civilization, which only deepens the real mystery. A society this stable, this prosperous, this content should not simply fade away. So why did it? The disappearance did not begin with a catastrophe. It began with a slow fading. We call it the late Harappan period, from around 1900 to 1300 years before the Common Era, and it was not a sudden fall. There was no single fire, no final battle, no day the cities died. Instead, there was a slow de-urbanization. It was not even uniform. Whole neighborhoods fell out of use while others nearby carried on. The cities did not collapse. They emptied, gradually, street by street, over generations. The theories about why have multiplied for a century, so let us take them one at a time. The most famous is the Aryan invasion. The idea that Indo-European speakers swept down from the north and conquered the region by force, ending the Indus world and ushering in a new age. There is a single haunting clue for it, a cluster of unburied bodies found near the gates of Mohenjo-Daro, long pointed to as a massacre. But across more than 1 million square kilometers, there is no evidence of widespread destruction. No burned cities in ruins, no conquered land. And here, the DNA delivers the verdict. Remember the absence from earlier, the steppe ancestry that simply was not there in the mature Indus population. If an army had poured down from the grasslands and replaced these people, the genome would carry its mark. It does not. There was no wave of incomers in this period to do the destroying. The invasion theory does not just lack the ruins, it lacks the bodies in the bloodline. It dies on the genetic evidence. Then there is climate. Analysis of ancient ice and shifting monsoon patterns shows the region drying during these centuries, the rains weakening, the rivers changing their behavior. The timing is imperfect because some cities lingered for hundreds of years after the shift began, but the pressure was real, and it was patient, and it was working on the one thing every Indus city depended on, which was reliable water and reliable harvests. And here the whole story turns, because this was never an extinction. The cities became unproductive places, and the people did exactly what their world had always allowed them to do. They left. They dissolved back into the countryside, into the villages that had been the true foundation all along. Remember that the great majority of them had always lived in those villages. There was somewhere to go, and a way of life still waiting there. The urban experiment ended. The people did not die. A civilization assembled from a fusion did not get wiped out and replaced. It absorbed and adapted and carried on. The steppe ancestry that does sit in modern South Asians arrived later, mixing into a population that was already there, already rooted, already ancient. The Indus were never erased from the bloodline of the subcontinent. The cities fell silent. The thread of the people never broke. Here's the thing that stays with me after weeks inside this material. The story of the Indus is almost always told as a vanishing. A brilliant people who built impossible cities and then evaporated, leaving only ruins and a script we cannot read. The DNA tells a different story. It tells of a people who were never a single migrating tribe at all, but a fusion of several, which is exactly why their origin never had a clean answer. And it tells of a civilization that did not die so much as dissolve, melting back into the villages and into the bloodline of an entire subcontinent. So they were never strangers who arrived, and they never truly left. They were here all along, and a part of them is here still. The cities fell silent. The script is still unread, but the people who built them never disappeared.